I have known Callum Aldrich Vane, the Duke of Dunrath, since we were boys of 8, stumbling through Latin conjugations at the same tutor's knee. I have seen him charge into battle without flinching. I have watched him stand before the full assembly of the House of Lords and speak with such cold authority that grown men shifted in their seats. I have, on 2 separate occasions, seen him reduce a duchess to tears simply by declining her invitation with 1 sentence. He is the most self-possessed man I have ever known. He believes himself entirely immune to sentiment, entirely in command of his own fate, and entirely ungovernable by any force on earth. He had never met his grandmother. I tell this story because I was present for nearly all of it, and because Callum himself refuses to tell it not from shame, but because every time someone asks him how it all began, he simply looks at his wife across the room with that expression that has replaced the cold one and says quietly, "Ask Evander. He'll enjoy it far too much." He is correct. I do enjoy it. I enjoy it because I watched the most impenetrable man I know be thoroughly, cheerfully, masterfully outmaneuvered by a woman of 73 who weighed perhaps 7 stone soaking wet, never raised her voice above a pleasant murmur, and always smelled of lavender and something that might have been triumph. Her name was Lady Isolde Vane, Dowager Duchess of Dunrath, and she had been writing Callum increasingly pointed letters for 2 years before he finally agreed to visit his ancestral estate in the far north. I was invited as what Callum called a buffer. I understood my role. I accepted it with pleasure. The letters had all said variations of the same thing. You are wasting yourself in London. The estate has not seen you since your father's funeral, and there is someone here I should very much like you to meet. Callum had read each one with the expression he reserves for parliamentary petitions he finds tedious, and each time he folded the letter, set it aside, and returned to whatever he had been doing. He was not a cruel man toward his grandmother. He simply did not believe she had anything to show him that London could not improve upon. I shall confess that I read one of those letters over his shoulder, the 4th one, I believe, and I found myself rather more intrigued than he was. The relevant line read, "She has a quality I have not seen in many decades, Callum, and you would know it too if you still remembered how to look at a person rather than through them." He had folded the letter and called her sentimental. I had thought, this ought to be interesting. It was a 3-day journey north by carriage. The landscape changed by degrees, the manicured parks of the south giving way to moors that swelled and darkened under a pewter sky, and by the time we rolled through the stone gates of Dunrath Hall on a cold afternoon in late March, the last light was failing, and the first snowdrops had begun to push through the wet earth along the drive. Callum watched them through the carriage window with the particular blank expression of a man filing a landscape away as adequate. He had not been here in 4 years. I had never been here at all, and I found it immediately, instinctively, true, the kind of place that does not perform its beauty but simply possesses it, in the way that old things do. Dunrath Hall was enormous and old and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been lived in by generations of the same family, and every stone corner holds something, a story, a grief, a small joy. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, met us at the door with the other staff assembled behind her, and Callum passed through them with the efficient courtesy of a man who knows how to be a duke without effort. He asked after the condition of the east wing roof. He remembered correctly the name of the head groom's wife. He was, in other words, entirely in charge of himself. Then his grandmother appeared at the top of the great staircase, and the first thing she said was, "You are thinner. Come here and let me look at you." He went up the stairs. She cupped his face in both her small hands and looked at him for a long moment. Something flickered across Callum's expression that I do not think he intended anyone to see. "Better," she said. Then she released him, turned to me and said, "Lord Evander Wraith, I have heard a great deal about you, very little of it reassuring. Come to dinner at 7. She did not wait for a response. She simply descended the staircase and moved off down a corridor as if she were the one who had just arrived somewhere, rather than us. I decided immediately that I adored her. We did not see the companion that first evening. I was aware of the arrangement. Callum had mentioned it dismissively somewhere in the second or third week after the letters began, saying that his grandmother had taken in a young woman of reduced circumstances to act as a reader and a secretary of sorts. He had said it in the same tone a man uses to note that a piece of furniture has been rearranged, mildly inconvenient, easily adjusted to. I confess I had forgotten about it entirely by the time dinner was served. The dining room at Dunrath was long and dark-paneled, lit by a chandelier that threw amber light across the table and left the edges of the room in a warm shadow. Lady Isolde sat at the head. Callum sat to her right, I to her left, and one chair remained empty across from me. A footman set a fourth place with unhurried efficiency. "My companion will be joining us shortly," Lady Isolde said. "She had a letter to finish for me. I am afraid I have a great deal of correspondence." Callum looked at the empty chair with the faint expression of a man adjusting his expectations downward. A companion, a young woman of reduced circumstances. He had, I suspected, already composed a picture in his mind. Adequate manners, little conversation, eyes permanently cast somewhere between the table and the floor. She arrived 6 minutes into the first course, slipping into the room with a quiet apology for her lateness, and taking her seat with the kind of unhurried composure that does not call attention to itself. Her name was Miss Maren Ashford. She was perhaps 24, with dark hair dressed practically and brown eyes that moved across the table once, taking in both of us, before settling into her soup with perfect equanimity. Callum glanced at her once, and then returned to his conversation with his grandmother about the estate accounts. I watched her. She was not what you would call a fashionable beauty, not the sort of woman the London drawing rooms would have arranged themselves around. Her gown was plain and well kept, her bearing quiet, and she made no effort whatsoever to insert herself into the conversation. And yet, there was something in the way she listened, a quality of attention that was entirely unperformed, as if she were genuinely interested in what was said rather than waiting for an opportunity to respond. When Lady Isolde made a dry observation about the local magistrate's opinion of himself, the companion smiled briefly, and it was the smile of someone who had noticed something rather than someone who was trying to be charming. I thought, Callum is not looking at her. Lady Isolde, on the other hand, was watching her grandson with an expression of someone who has planted a seed and is content to wait. After the second course, the dowager said, quite casually, "Maren, do tell our guests what you were reading to me this morning." The companion set down her glass. "Gibbon, your grace." "The third volume." Callum turned to look at her for the first time since she had sat down. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "What did you make of it?" he said. It was not quite a question, it was more the tone of a test. "I found his confidence rather more interesting than his conclusions," she said. "He knows so well what the causes of things are. I wonder sometimes if knowing is harder than he makes it seem." There was a pause. "That is a precise objection," Callum said, in a different tone than before. "Maren reads everything," Lady Isolde said warmly, and turned to pour more wine with the serenity of someone who has done nothing of significance. I caught her eye across the table. She smiled at me over her glass. I understood then that this was only the beginning. The next morning brought the first of the grandmother's maneuvers, and I say this having now had several years to reconstruct the campaign in its entirety. At the time I witnessed only pieces of it. The rest I assembled later from Callum himself, who told it to me haltingly and only once, and from the companion, from Maren, who, when I asked her directly, some years after the fact, laughed and said, "Oh, she told me exactly what she was doing. She said it was more sporting that way." I have tried to imagine what it was like to be Lady Isolde, to have watched her grandson move through life behind glass for years, efficient and impeccable and entirely unreachable, and to have seen in a quiet woman with a Gibbon volume and an unperformed smile the particular key that fit the particular lock. I think she must have recognized something, some quality of directness, of genuine attention, of ease with silence, that matched what she knew of who Callum was under the glass. She had been watching him for 20 years longer than I had. She knew him differently. The first maneuver was simple. Dunrath Hall's library was in a state of partial disorganization. Callum had been made aware of this in one of the letters, and Lady Isolde proposed that Marin, who had taken on the task of cataloging it, might benefit from his guidance on the organization of the family histories. He knew the provenance of each branch, and the task would go more quickly with his help. Callum agreed because he was too well-bred to decline, and because he did, in fact, care about the family histories. He would not have admitted that, but he agreed. I know what happened in the library over those first 2 mornings, because Callum told me about it later in the oblique way he reports things that have unsettled him. That is, by reporting only the facts and none of his own reaction to them, in the hope that I will draw no conclusions. He reported that Miss Ashford worked with unusual efficiency, that she had developed a cataloging system of considerable intelligence before he arrived, and that she did not defer to his opinions but engaged with them, disagreed once on a question of shelving logic, and turned out to be correct. He reported this last fact with a flatness that told me everything. He also reported, and I treasured this particular detail, that she had on the second morning placed a secondary text beside him on the table without comment, open to a page that directly contradicted something he had said the previous day about the dating of a family correspondence, and had then returned to her own work and said nothing, simply allowed him to read it. He had read it. He had looked up at her. She had not looked back. She had been writing. He had said, "You are correct," and she had said without looking up, "I know, but you reached it yourself, so it will stick." He said this to me with the particular expression of a man who does not know whether he has been bested or given a gift, and suspects it may be both. I, meanwhile, was being very gently interrogated by Lady Isolde over the breakfast table each morning. "You have known him since boyhood," she said, on the second morning, not looking up from her toast. "What was he like before he learned to be a duke?" I considered. "Curious," I said. "He used to ask our tutor follow-up questions until the poor man ran out of answers. He read everything he could put his hands on. He argued about ideas rather than precedent." Lady Isolde nodded as if I had confirmed something. "And then his father died." "Yes. And he became very good at being a duke," she said, "and rather less good at being himself." She set down her toast and looked out the window at the early spring moor. "He does not need someone who admires him, Lord Evander. He is admired constantly, and it has done him no good. He needs someone who will look at him and see the person rather than the title." I said, "You believe Miss Ashford does that?" "I believe," said Lady Isolde, "that she does not know how to do anything else. She was not raised in rooms where one learns to be impressed by titles. Her father was a schoolmaster. She read his library before she was 12. She is honest not as a virtue but as a constitution. It is simply how she is built." She picked up her toast again. "Callum will find it alarming at first. He is not used to it." "He will find it alarming," I agreed. "Whether that leads where you intend it to is another matter." She smiled. "He came, didn't he? I wrote 4 letters and he came." He would not have come if there were nothing in him left to reach. This was either wisdom or determination. I was not sure there was much difference. I should say something here about the companion herself, about Marin Ashford, because I think the way she is sometimes described afterward does not capture her accurately. She is sometimes spoken of as a clever girl who laid a trap, or as a sweet and passive creature who was simply fortunate in her benefactress. Neither is right. She was, when I knew her in those early days at Dunrath, a young woman in a genuinely difficult position, handling it with a self-possession that I found remarkable. Her father had died 3 years before, leaving debts she could not repay and a situation she had not anticipated. She had come to Lady Isolde through the recommendation of a clergyman who knew the family, and she had been at Dunrath for 8 months by the time we arrived. She liked the work. She liked the old woman. She read Gibbon and argued about it without apology. And she was not, as far as I could tell, attempting to become a duchess. This was perhaps the most important thing about her, and the thing Lady Isolde understood and Callum did not yet, which was that Marin Ashford's attention was genuine because she was genuinely interested in the books, in the ideas, in the conversations, rather than in what those conversations might yield. She was not performing. And that quality of absolute non-performance was what made her, in the end, so entirely disarming. On the 4th day, the grandmother took to her rooms with a cold. This was, I suspected immediately, entirely strategic. Lady Isolde was 73 and brisk and had not had a cold in living memory, or if she had not let it slow her. The cold announced itself at breakfast, required her to retire by 10 in the morning, and produced from her, before she went, the following observation. "Marin, dear, do see that our guests are looked after. Callum knows the grounds, but he has been away long enough that he may not remember where the new paths run. The East Walk is particularly fine this time of year. The snowdrops are coming in along the wall." Then she was gone, leaving Callum, myself, and the companion alone in the breakfast room. I announced, perhaps 30 seconds later, that I had letters to write and excused myself. Callum looked at the door through which I had retreated with an expression that was, for him, relatively transparent. He understood exactly what was happening. He then looked at the companion, who was finishing her tea with the same equanimity she brought to everything. She set her cup down and said, without any trace of the performance the situation might have invited, "I don't mind showing you the East Walk if you'd like to see it. Your grandmother is right that it's pleasant. But equally you might prefer to see to your correspondence, and I can simply tell her we walked." He stared at her for a moment. "You would do that?" "She loves you very much," Marin said simply. "She wants you to be happy. If walking with me would make you uncomfortable, it is far simpler to spare her the worry and tell her we went." There was quite a long silence. "I am not uncomfortable," Callum said, in a voice that suggested he was, in fact, slightly uncomfortable, but in an entirely different way than she meant. "They walked. I know this because I watched them from the upstairs window of the study, not to spy, but because once I saw them set off together, I found I could not look away. I watched them move along the east wall where the snowdrops did, indeed, run in white ribbons against the gray stone. I could not hear them. But I could see the quality of the walking, the way it was not the stilted progress of two people fulfilling an obligation, but the slightly faster, slightly more turned toward each other movement of people who are talking about something that interests them. At one point she stopped and pointed at something along the wall. I could not see what, and he looked, and then he said something, and she turned to answer, and for a moment they were simply two people standing in the early spring light by a wall of snowdrops, arguing about something, equally engaged. I thought, Lady Isolde is going to be very pleased with herself. They were gone for nearly 2 hours. When they returned, Callum came to find me in the study. He stood in the doorway for a moment as if organizing something. "She speaks 4 languages," he said. "Does she?" "French, Latin, Italian, and some Greek. She learned the Latin and the Greek from her father's books. She has never been taught formally." He paused. "She spotted an error in the Gibbon translation we have in the library, a passage in the 6th chapter. She noticed it because her Latin is good enough to hold the original in her head while she reads the English." "That is impressive," I said. "I told her she ought to have been an academic." "What did she say?" Another pause. "She said she was aware of that. She said she had found, however, that life had a way of assigning one's position by means other than aptitude, and that she had decided it was more interesting to be curious about where she'd ended up than aggrieved about where she hadn't." He said this last sentence very carefully, as if he were reading it off a page inside his own head. I waited. She was not saying it to be admirable, he said. She was just saying it. I know, I said. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has noticed that the ground is shifting under him and is not yet certain whether to step back or keep walking. Grandmother is a schemer, he said. Yes, I agreed. It is entirely transparent. Completely. He stood there a moment longer. The East Walk is very pleasant, he said, and then he left. Lady Isolde's cold lasted 4 more days. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. The days that followed had a rhythm that I think neither Callum nor Marin quite recognized they were falling into, which is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about it, that something that was, from the outside, plainly a courtship, had entirely no feel of performance from the inside. They read in the library on the afternoons when the weather was bad. They walked when it was fine. They argued, with genuine heat, about Gibbon's handling of the early empire, and I sat in the corner with my own book and listened to my friend produce counterarguments I had not heard him make in years, counterarguments that required him to go and find a secondary text to prove his point, which then led to a tangential conversation about the translation of a different text entirely, which lasted until the light failed. I should record some of this more precisely, because the texture of those days matters to the story. On the 5th morning, the weather turned sharp and wet and closed them into the library from after breakfast until supper. I was with them for the first 2 hours and then retreated to the warmth of the morning room with my own correspondence. When I returned at midday, intending to suggest we eat, I found them at opposite ends of the long table with books spread between them and a conversation running that had clearly been going without interruption. Callum on his feet, one hand on the back of his chair, making a point about the administrative structure of the late empire, and Marin with her chin resting on her hand, listening with that full, unornamented attention of hers, and then saying, when he finished, "But that assumes the correspondence was accurate. Do we know it was?" He stopped. He had not considered this. I could see him considering it now, and the particular quality of his stillness was the stillness of a man who is genuinely thinking, not composing a reply, and I thought, he does not do this with anyone in London, not anymore. He has not done this in years. I left them and went to find something to eat on my own. On another afternoon, the 5th day, or perhaps the 6th, I passed the open library door and heard her reading aloud. I did not intend to stop, but I stopped. She was reading Latin, translating as she went, and the translation was not the careful, halting kind that one produces when one is working to remember. It was fluid and considered, the kind that comes from genuine possession of the language, and she was reading to him as easily as if she were reading English, occasionally pausing to offer 2 possible renderings of a phrase and asking him which he felt was more accurate. He was listening. He said at one point, "The second the first loses the weight of the subjunctive," and she said, "Yes, that's what I thought," and went on reading. And in the quiet of the corridor outside I stood for a moment and understood that the library had become, in the space of less than a week, the place where something private was being built, not arranged, not performed, but quietly, genuinely built, the way things are built when 2 people discover they are working on the same thing and do not need to announce it. On one of these evenings, the 6th, I believe, they argued so intently about a single untranslatable Latin phrase that they were still going when Mrs. Price came to say the candles in the east section were running low. Callum sent for more candles. I had long since stopped pretending to read my own book, and was simply watching them with the undisguised pleasure of a man who has been waiting a long time to see his friend come back to himself. Marin was leaning across the table to point at the relevant passage in the open volume between them, her finger on the page, making her argument with the same focused certainty she brought to everything. Callum was listening, truly listening, not waiting, and when she finished he said, "You're reading it as an observation. I think he intends a judgment, She looked at him. Why? He pulled the book toward him and found the paragraph before it. She read over his shoulder. A pause. Oh, she said. And then, you're right. There was something in the way she said it, simply, without ceremony, without the performance of concession, that made him look up from the page and directly at her, at close range, as if something had come briefly and unexpectedly into focus. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. Then she reached across and turned the page, and the conversation continued as if nothing had shifted, which meant, of course, that everything had. He was, I realized, coming alive. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the quiet, specific opposite of going behind glass. The way a window that has been shut against the cold for a long season is opened inch by inch as the spring comes in. I also noticed, with considerable interest, that Maren was not unaffected. She was too honest for that and too intelligent. She knew what she was feeling before he did, I think, and she treated it with the same directness she brought to everything, which was to say that she did not pretend it was not there, but she did not act on it either, because to act on it in her position would have been, in her view, a liberty she had not been offered. This was, if I am being precise, the quality that made everything that followed inevitable. She had, as Lady Isolde had said, been built for honesty, and it is very hard to be in a room with someone like that for very long without finding yourself, in spite of everything, telling them the truth. On the 7th evening, after dinner, Callum's grandmother produced a piece of news. She had, she said, received a letter from her nephew, Lord Crestham, informing her that he would be arriving at Dunrath in 3 days' time, along with his wife and his wife's sister, Miss Venetia Pell, who was, Lady Isolde added mildly, considered one of the great beauties of the season. I believe Crestham has been making some effort to introduce her to eligible gentlemen, she said, examining the letter. He mentioned, let me find the passage. Yes, here it is. I am certain Dunrath will provide Venetia with a pleasing introduction to the Northern County Society, and I am told the Duke is in residence. There was a small silence. Callum set down his wine glass. He did not look at Maren. But I was watching Maren, and the very brief, very contained thing that crossed her face was enough. She returned to her wine with perfect steadiness. It told me everything. I was not aware you had invited them, Callum said to his grandmother. I didn't, said Lady Isolde pleasantly. I never do. Crestham invites himself. He has done so since he was 12. I have given up objecting. It is simpler to feed him. And Miss Pell? I know nothing about Miss Pell, his grandmother said, setting the letter down with the serenity of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. She may be entirely charming. She may be extraordinarily dull. The beauty is, as they say, entirely irrelevant to the question. She did not specify what question. She did not need to. Callum excused himself shortly afterward. I sat with the two women for a while longer. Lady Isolde worked at her needlepoint without comment. Maren read. The fire settled. The room was very quiet in the comfortable way of rooms that have been inhabited by people who are easy with one another. She's not worried, Lady Isolde said eventually, without looking up from her embroidery, as if she were thinking aloud. No, I said. She's too practical to be worried about something she can't influence. A pause. And Callum is too intelligent to be distracted by surface things. He was at one time, he is not any more, people change. She said a stitch. He will need to arrive at it himself, of course. That is the nature of the thing. You cannot tell him, he would simply dig in. He must discover it, as he discovers everything, by going and looking until he finds it for himself. I looked at the companion, who had turned a page and given no indication of having heard any of this, which I did not for a moment believe. I found Callum in the study an hour later, standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking out at the dark moor. Evander, he said without turning, what do you know about feelings? I sat down. Quite a lot, actually. You never asked. I'm asking now. I thought about what to say. I decided on the simple version. I know that you have not talked about an idea with genuine pleasure in approximately 4 years. I know that you argued about Gibbon for 3 hours yesterday and that your face was different afterward. I know that when Miss Ashford said, at dinner on Thursday, that she found it difficult to trust anyone who had never been embarrassed by their own certainty, you laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since we arrived. He said nothing. I am not telling you what to do, I said. I am only reporting what I have observed. She is my grandmother's companion, he said. Yes. She is here as an employee. Yes. I cannot simply. You could, I said, speak to her, as yourself, rather than as the Duke of Dunrath. You are quite different people, and I think she would prefer the first one. He turned from the window. You are not a buffer, he said. You are an accomplice. Your grandmother is very persuasive, I said. He sat down. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a different voice, the voice of the boy at the tutor's knee who asked follow-up questions until he ran out of answers, do you think she is happy here? I think, I said carefully, that she is a person who makes herself content with what she has, because she is practical and because she is curious, and because she has decided those are better tools than grievance. I do not think that is the same as being happy. He looked at his hands. I think, I said, even more carefully, that she would be happier if she were more certain of her position. I left him with that. The party from Crestham arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, Lord and Lady Crestham in the first carriage, Miss Venetia Pell in the second, attended by her maid. Miss Pell was, I can confirm, everything that had been suggested, fair, elegant, well-dressed, possessed of excellent manners and a laugh that carried pleasantly across rooms. She was also, I could see within the first hour, absolutely right for some other story entirely, not this one. She required admiration in the precise way that Callum no longer had any interest in providing it. She was lovely and she knew it, and while this was not a flaw, it was a register he no longer spoke. Lady Isolde received them all with the warm authority of a woman who has been managing the unexpected for 73 years. Marin withdrew to her usual quietness, not effacing herself. She had too much self-possession for that, but simply moving to the edge of the social arrangement, where she was entirely at home. Miss Pell noticed her on the second day. I was in the drawing room when it happened, one of those moments that announces itself before anything is said. Miss Pell said, in the tone of a woman who does not intend to be unkind but has not been taught to be careful, "And you are Lady Isolde's reader, is that right? How industrious of you." She smiled with perfect warmth. She meant nothing by it. It was simply the thing one said. Marin looked at her for a moment with those direct brown eyes. I read to her, yes, she said. And I manage her correspondence and her estate accounts, and I catalogue the library. It is a great deal of work and I am very fond of it. She said it without heat. She said it as a fact. She then asked Miss Pell whether she had had a comfortable journey north, and the conversation moved on. But Callum had been standing by the window. He had not moved during any of it. He stood there for another moment after it was over, and then he crossed the room, not toward Miss Pell, not toward me, but toward the small table near the window where Marin had returned to her place, and he sat down beside her, and he said something, I could not hear it, and she looked at him with a brief, unguarded expression that she recovered almost immediately. Whatever he had said, it was not something that required a public answer. She simply looked at him, and then she looked back at her work, and the line of her shoulders had eased by a fraction that no one but I and perhaps Lady Isolde, across the room, would have noticed. He stayed there for the rest of the afternoon. Lady Isolde, needle-pointing serenely nearby, did not look up from her work, but the corner of her mouth moved. I will not pretend that the next 2 days were not uncomfortable in certain quarters. Lord Crestham was a jovial, oblivious man who noticed nothing. Lady Crestham noticed everything and said nothing with diplomatic precision. Miss Pell was sharp enough to read the room, and was, to her considerable credit, gracious about it. She had, I think, enough self-knowledge to recognize that whatever was happening here did not involve her, and she settled into enjoying the estate and the more views and her cousin's company with a cheerfulness I respected. And something was happening. The surface of it, if you had been observing from outside the house, from the moor, let us say, looking in at the lit windows of Dunrath Hall, would have looked like very little. Two people at a table, a duke and a companion talking. That was all. But the content of it, the quality of it, that had changed. He was not presenting himself to her any more. He was not demonstrating competence or authority or the particular brand of well-bred ease that he deployed in social rooms. He was simply there, asking her things and listening to the answers, telling her, in the way he told almost no one, what he actually thought, rather than what he had decided was the appropriate thing to think. She met this without performance. She met it, as she met everything, directly, with the same honest attention she had turned on the gibbon in the library, the same quality of care that did not announce itself. I watched him understand by degrees that he had been seen, not the Duke, him, the boy who had asked too many questions, the man who had gone behind glass when his father died and convinced himself it was competence. She was not trying to reach him. She was only being herself, and the two things, her honesty, his recognition, had met like two rivers quietly in the dark, and turned into the same water. On the third night of the Crestham visit, Callum came to my room after midnight. He knocked twice and then opened the door without waiting for a response, because he has always done this and 40 years of friendship have not corrected it. He stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves and said, without preamble, "I need to speak to her." "Yes," I said. "Tomorrow, before the Cresthams leave." "Yes," I said again. "Evander, if she—" He stopped. He was not a man who had practice with this. "If she does not, if this is entirely in my own." "It isn't," I said. He looked at me. "It isn't," I said again firmly. "But you should know that she will not make it easy for you. Not because she is cruel, she isn't, not remotely, but because her position makes her careful, and because she is too honest to pretend to feel something she doesn't and too practical to act on something she's not certain of. You will need to be clear. None of the oblique ducal manner. You will need to actually say it." He was very still for a moment. "I can do that," he said. I believed him. He left. I lay in the dark and thought about two rivers meeting quietly. In the morning he found her in the library. This I know from him, told to me years later, and from Marin, who tells it better and will, occasionally, if you press her, tell it whole. I piece it together here as best I can. She was at the long table in the east section of the library, cataloging the correspondence files they had not yet reached, when he came in and closed the door. She looked up, saw his expression, and set her pen down. He said, "I want to be very direct with you. I have been told it is necessary." She said, "By Lord Evander." "Yes." "He is probably right," she said. "He generally is." He stood at the other end of the table. He was, she told me once, more uncertain in that moment than she had seen him in all the days before, not the cold uncertainty of a man out of his depth in a social situation, but the particular nakedness of someone who has decided to tell the truth and is about to. "I do not want you to be uncertain of your position here," he said. "And I am aware that what I am about to say will make it harder for you, not easier, unless you feel, unless there is something in it that I am making a mess of this." "You're doing well enough," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I would like for you to stay," he said. "Not as my grandmother's companion. I would like—" He stopped, started again. "I was not going to come here. I read 4 letters and put them aside and found reasons not to come. And then I came and you argued about Gibbon translation and told me you had decided to be curious instead of aggrieved, and you were not saying it to be admirable. You were just saying it, and I have not been able to." He stopped again. Marin said nothing. but she had come around to his end of the table. He told me, without quite deciding to, the way a person moves towards something without announcing their intention. "I am not a man who says things easily," he said. "I should tell you that. I have been told it is a significant flaw." "I know," she said. "You make up for it by being a man who means what he says." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I mean this." She looked at him for a long moment, that direct, unperforming, entirely honest look that had, over the course of 11 days and 2 hours of walking along a snowdrop wall, and 3 hours of Gibbon, and one late evening about the nature of certainty, become the thing he thought about more than he thought about anything else. She said, "I know." I do not have the precise sequence of what was said after that, because neither of them reported it in linear terms, and I think the sequence ceased to matter. What I know is that they came out of the library an hour and a half later, Callum preceding her and going immediately to find his grandmother, and Marin coming to find me in the morning room with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not a happy expression, exactly, or not only, but the expression of someone who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has just been told they are allowed to set it down. She said, "I need to ask you something." "Anything." Does he say things he doesn't mean? I know that's an odd question. I've known him 11 days. "No," I said. "He never has. In 40 years I have never known him to say something he did not mean." She looked down at her hands. Then she looked up at me and said, "He asked me to marry him." "Yes," I said, "I expected he would." "He said," she stopped. Then she said softly, "He said he had been looking through people for years rather than at them, and that I had made it impossible to continue." I thought about what Lady Isolde had said at breakfast on the second day. She needs someone who will look at him and see the person rather than the title. It runs both ways, a thing like that. "Did you accept?" I said. She looked at me with those steady eyes, and for the first time in 11 days she was, unambiguously, purely happy. "Yes," she said. I found the grandmother in her rooms. She had not yet come down, and I knocked and let myself in. She was at her writing table, pen in hand, entirely calm, as if she were waiting for someone to come and tell her that the thing she had set in motion had arrived at its natural conclusion. "Well," she said. "They are engaged," I said. She set down her pen. She looked out the window at the moor, where the snowdrops were coming in properly now along the eastern wall, white and small and absolutely certain. She said, "I know." "You always knew," I said. "No," she said. "I knew the seed. You never know what grows until it does." She turned back to her writing table and picked up her pen. "Tell Mrs. Price we shall need champagne for dinner." That evening, the evening of the engagement, we sat at dinner, all 4 of us, and the tone of the table was unlike anything that had come before. Lady Isolde did not make speeches. She simply presided with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has accomplished exactly what she intended and sees no need to belabor the point. She poured champagne from the bottle Mrs. Price had produced, and she raised her glass and said, "To curiosity," which was, as both Callum and Marin understood, not a generic toast but a very specific and entirely intentional one. And they both looked at her with different expressions. Callum's the expression of a man who has just realized the full extent of what has been managed, and Marin's the expression of someone who is trying not to smile and not quite succeeding. Callum said, "You knew." "I hoped," his grandmother corrected, setting down her glass. "There is a distinction. You wrote 4 letters and staged an illness." "I wrote 4 letters over 2 years," she said, "which is very restrained if you think about it." And the cold was genuine enough for its purpose. She looked at him across the table with the serenity of absolute conviction. "You would not have come otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in a different voice than I had heard from him in 4 years, "No, I would not have." He glanced at Marin. Something passed between them that was not for the room. Lady Isolde watched this, and then returned to her champagne with the air of a gardener, observing that the thing she planted has, as she fully expected, grown. We sat at the table for 2 hours that evening. The conversation ranged easily across subjects and returned to small things and found, occasionally, a moment of real laughter. The quality of it was different from every dinner that had come before. Something had settled, something had been named. The Crestham party departed the following morning. Lord Crestham, who had gathered approximately nothing of what had occurred under his nose, shook Callum's hand and said it had been a very pleasant visit. Lady Crestham kissed Callum on the cheek and then looked at Marin with an expression of intelligent warmth and said, "I shall be writing to your grandmother, your Grace," which was her way of saying she understood exactly what had happened and approved of it. Miss Pell, to her lasting credit, embraced Marin briefly as she left, and whispered something in her ear that made Marin, for the second time that morning, laugh out loud. I have thought in the years since about what made it possible, what the grandmother understood and arranged and waited for, and what it was in those two people that met when it met. I have turned it over many times. There is a version of this story, the version some people tell who know only the broad outline, in which Lady Isolde is simply a shrewd old matchmaker who put two eligible people in proximity and let nature take its course. That version is not wrong exactly, but it misses what she actually saw. She saw that her grandson had closed himself off in a particular way, at a particular time, for reasons that were understandable and had cost him a great deal. And she saw that the closing had been thorough and long and was beginning to seem permanent. She saw that what he needed was not a mirror, not someone who would reflect back his power and his title and the image he had made of himself, but a window, someone through whom the world came in differently, someone whose way of being in the world was so constitutionally honest that it was simply not possible to be in a room with her for very long and maintain a false version of yourself, someone who would argue about Gibbon. And she saw that Marin Ashford, who had lost her father and her circumstances, and found herself in the north with an old woman and a library, and a set of languages she had taught herself from books, and who had decided to be curious rather than aggrieved, she saw that this young woman had something very rare, not ambition, not strategy, just a quality of attention, a quality of honesty, a constitution built for looking at people and seeing them plainly. That was the exact and particular key to the exact and particular lock she had spent 20 years watching close. She planted a seed, she called it hope, she waited. The wedding was held that June at Dunrath Hall, which Marin had chosen because, she said, it was her home, and she was not going to be married anywhere else. The ceremony was in the small chapel on the estate grounds, the same chapel where Callum's parents had been married and his grandfather before them. The snowdrops were long past by then, but the early summer heather had begun to come in on the moor, and the light that came through the chapel windows was the long, pale gold of a northern June evening. Lady Isolde sat in the first row with the stillness of a woman who has watched a great deal of the world and has learned that the best moments in it do not need comment. She wore deep green silk, very upright, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at no one but her grandson as he took his place at the front of the chapel, and he, for once, was not composed in the ducal manner. He was simply present, that was all. Standing in the chapel of his family's history, waiting for the one person who had looked at him and found, underneath the title, someone worth looking at. Marin came down the aisle in a gown that was not fashionable and was not trying to be cream silk, plain and well cut, with her dark hair pinned back and a few small sprigs of early heather tucked into it, the only ornament she wanted. She had told me the night before that she did not wish to look like something she was not. She already knew, she said, what she was becoming. She did not need to begin it with a costume. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from the very beginning, directly, without apology, seeing the person. He looked at her the same way, as if he were finally doing it properly. I stood beside him as his witness. He had not asked me to give a speech, for which I was grateful, and which I took as proof that he knew me well enough to understand I would make it entirely too long. Afterward, in the long light of the northern evening, with the household and the few guests assembled on the lawns, I found Lady Isolde standing apart from the others, looking out at the moor. The heather was not yet purple, that would come in August, but the slopes were already turning in the long light, and the estate lay spread before us in the quiet authority of a place that has always known what it is. "Are you pleased?" I asked. She considered. "I am relieved," she said. "There is a particular anxiety that comes from seeing clearly what someone needs and being unable to simply tell them. You can only arrange the ground and step back. You arranged it masterfully." She gave me a sharp look. "I wrote letters and staged a cold. Masterfully may be generous." The cold was very convincing. "I thought so," she said, and permitted herself a small smile. We watched Callum and Marin in the last of the evening light. He had his hand at the small of her back, and she was saying something to him, something that made the corner of his mouth lift in the way it now lifted, regularly, when she spoke. He was looking at her, not through her. "Do you know what she told me?" Lady Isolde said. "When I first engaged her, I asked her what she was best at. She thought about it for a moment, and she said, 'I am very good at paying attention.' She said it without vanity, as if it were simply a fact, the way she might say she was good at French." She paused. "I knew then." "I thought about this. And him," I said. "What was it in him that told you it could work?" She was quiet for a moment. "He still asked questions," she said. "He had built all of that around himself, the coldness, the distance, the glass, but he still, in his letters to me, asked questions. He asked how the estate was faring. He asked about the tenants. He asked if the library had been properly maintained. Closed people don't ask questions, they issue statements." She turned to look at me. He was still curious, Lord Evander. He had simply forgotten that curiosity applied to people too. She was right, she was entirely right. She had seen it in a handful of letters, across 4 years and 100 miles of distance, and she had seen the solution in a girl with dark hair and brown eyes who read Gibbon and taught herself Greek from her father's books, and had decided to be curious rather than aggrieved. She had planted a seed, and what grew from it, the warmth, the opening, the late-night conversation, the snowdrop walk, the library and the arguments about translation, the moment in which a cold man said, "I mean this," and a careful woman said, "I know." What grew from it was not what she had planted exactly. What grew from it was better. I have attended a great many events in my life, weddings and funerals, and the kind of social performance that the English aristocracy has elevated to an art form. I have stood in rooms where enormous amounts of money and status and beauty were all in play and watched people navigate them with the skills they had spent their lives acquiring. I have seen, from the inside, how much of it is armor. I have never seen anything quite like watching Callum Vane, the Duke of Dunrath, in the years since that June wedding, watching the armor become, gradually and permanently, unnecessary. He did not lose his competence. He did not become less formidable in the ways that mattered. He simply no longer needed the glass. He looked at people. He asked questions. He was wrong occasionally and said so, which was the most extraordinary development of all. I remember, at a dinner in London some 18 months after the wedding, watching him tell a man 3 ranks his senior that he was mistaken about the terms of a particular parliamentary vote, and then, when the man pushed back, say with complete equanimity, "I may be. I'll check and tell you if I am." The man stared at him. The old Callum would have simply been correct and cold and final about it. This Callum was interested in the truth, which is a different thing entirely. The change in him was not dramatic. It never announced itself, but it accumulated over the months and years after Dunrath into something unmistakable. He was present in a way he had not been. He was in the room he was actually in, rather than behind the glass of duty and management and the performance of authority. It was Marin who had done it, And she had done it not by trying but simply by being the particular person. She was constitutionally incapable of treating him as a title, constitutionally incapable of performing anything, and constitutionally incapable of looking at a person and seeing anything other than the person. He had not known before her that he was lonely. He had confused the glass with competence and the distance with dignity, and she had, over 11 days and a great quantity of gibbon, made both positions untenable. He and Marin had, when last I visited, a library that had been entirely reorganized, a catalog system of considerable intelligence, and a running argument about the merits of a secondary Latin text that had apparently been going on for 3 years and showed no signs of resolution. The argument was, from what I could observe, considerably more enjoyable than either of them winning would have been. There were also 2 small children, a boy of 4 with his father's dark eyes and his mother's entirely unintimidated manner of looking at things, and a girl of 2 who had already decided that the lower library shelves were full of possibilities and that the word no applied to other people. Marin redirected her away from the manuscripts with the composed efficiency of a woman who has spent years filing things in precise order and does not intend to lose the system now. Callum watched from across the room with an expression I had not seen on his face in 40 years of knowing him. I shall not attempt to describe it. Some things do not require description. Lady Isolde is still alive and still at Dunrath, and she still plays the role of what she calls the architectural background. She has taken on a new reading project, a very large philosophical history that she says will take her approximately 3 years to get through. And she has told Marin, with the serenity of someone who has never been in any doubt about anything, that she expects regular arguments about its contents. She told me, the last time I visited, that she had been entirely confident. "You were not confident," I said. "You were anxious." "I was briefly anxious," she said. "Then I was confident." "You wrote 4 letters." "I wrote them at quarterly intervals," she said, which she appeared to believe made it better, "and staged an entire illness." She looked at me with the patience of a woman who has been underestimated for 73 years and finds it mostly entertaining. "Lord Evander," she said, "I planted a seed. What grew was theirs." She was right about that too. She generally was. I have known Callum Aldrich Vane since we were 8 years old, and I have watched him become, in the years since a quiet woman argued about Gibbon translation and decided to be curious rather than aggrieved, the most genuinely present man I know. He would tell you, if you asked, that he did it himself. He would say he made the choice and asked the question and meant what he said, and he would be right. He did. He does. But I was there at Dunrath in late March, when the snowdrops were coming in along the east wall, and I know what I saw. I saw a seed planted with extraordinary precision by a woman of 73 who knew exactly which kind of ground to plant it in and exactly what it needed to grow. I saw it take root in the cold northern light. I saw what grew. I saw a duke who learned, 11 days into spring, to look at someone and see them. That, as it turned out, was everything.